and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin today's program with the Golden Week, the 8th-day holiday in China. This year, the National Day and Mid-Autumn Festival coincide on October the 1st. This year, the enthusiasm of Chinese people even surpassed their feelings during the Spring Festival due to the severe situation of COVID-19 pandemic back then. Now, with the situation well under control so far in China, we see notable sites and resorts all over the country embracing visitors from afar and wide. Data till the 7th shows that China has seen more than 10 million rail trips every day since National Day on October the 1st. That came as many people took advantage of the efficiency of high-speed railways to enjoy day trips close to home. Meanwhile, the highway has also been a popular option, with nearly 5 million road trips on average every day over the holiday. Meanwhile, the country's consumer spending has recovered, witnessing a hike since the outbreak of the coronavirus. Does Golden Week consumer spending able to help China put its best foot forward? Let's loop in our panelists. For National Holiday and the Chinese economy, in Bangkok, Professor Jeffrey Towson, Guanghua School of Management with Peking University, has been a keen observer of the Chinese economy for years. In Beijing, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from International Business and Economics University. Welcome to both of you, professors. 45 billion yuan. That has already been spent over the past 7 days since the National Day holiday began. This is the latest number we have got. Meanwhile, 600 million tourists traveling on the National Day holiday. That's amazing numbers. Professor Liu, briefly.
Well, we can see that the situation with the mixed feeling. Now the traffic jam in the tourist parks, etc., are really annoying. But in the meantime, the broader picture shows that Chinese economy has almost recovered, and life becomes so normal that half of the nation are really traveling. It's sort of a rebellious behavior because people has been caged for the last almost half a year, and now it is really time. And more is that people are confident about their security, about their safety, and now everything becomes normal.
I see. Mr. Towson, though, when we talk about China's economy almost recovered, what are some of the main key factors we really need to look at the numbers before we reach that conclusion?
Well, I think there's the overall numbers. How big is Chinese tourism? And we're not at the level we were last year, even with, there's a lot of sort of outbound tourism being converted into inbound tourism because people aren't flying to, say, Bangkok like they would have last year.
No.
So we're getting a bit of a bump in that regard domestically. But even then, the numbers aren't what they were last year. But, I mean, who's comparing this year to last year? I mean, it's a steady and big step forward in terms of let's get back to life. Let's get the tourism industry, which has been really hit very hard. Let's get those companies back on their feet, hotels, tour operators, attractions, restaurants. So I think, really across the board, big step forward. And, this is the way you get back. So in the right direction, I think.
Though there are differences in the way people are spending and also in how facilities are being offering, services are being offered also. For example, parks, national parks these days are still having only 75% of the original number they could have because of being cautious for health reasons. And people need to book their tickets mainly 1 day ahead, though they usually would have a ticket anyway. Meanwhile, we also see tourists quite cautious, still wearing masks if you go to the these places, particularly here in Beijing, very cautious still, and that become almost a part of the habit. So how do you see COVID-19 is having its impact, both psychological and certainly economically, on the Chinese consumers, Professor Liu?
Definitely, that's going to have vast impact on the lifestyle and also on the work habit of the people. One is that people are shifting more online, and even if the COVID-19 disappears, the reliance and the confidence in online information and online service will be there and will be consolidated. And the other is that the logistics, in terms of the provision and the delivery service will be there and continue to be very strong.
Mr. Townsend, China has been talking about two circulations, so-called double circulations of its economy, internal circulations mainly within the country, and also external circulations that has been always functioning over the past decades with the rest of the world. Now, it seems that the internal one is working as it should be, but how much will it be able to become the engine of the economy? And how do you see the relations between the so-called internal and the external?
I mean, it depends if we're talking about, let's say, services or products. If we're talking about products, well, things are still coming out of Chinese factories. They're going on ships. They're going out to the world. So that external part is, moving along as you'd expect, and the export numbers look fairly good.
And imports too. There are ships that are coming
right,
in
and
with all kinds of products coming from all over the world as well.
Right, but when we start talking about services, well, services by definition are sort of person to person, right? That's kind of what services are. So healthcare, tourism, education. Okay, we're seeing some pretty big changes here. How many Chinese students are going to some university in Europe this year versus last year? How many foreign tourists are coming into China right now? Not very many. So really, I think what we're seeing is on the dual circulation question, some sectors are just going to be going down because people aren't getting on planes this year. But I also think we're probably going to see some adaptation. Education, you can kind of move that online. Domestic tourism has bumped up because outbound tourism has kind of dropped. So I mean, we're going to see a sort of a shifting pattern there. But generally speaking, people are doing a lot less stuff in person than they did a year ago. So services are probably going to take a hit. But China is lucky in that it's a big enough country that the domestic market is significant, and that's not what most countries have.
How much space is there, Professor Liu, for the so-called domestic circulation? Well, that's only a terminology being invented recently. That has always been the logic of any economy, isn't it? You have the interactions among different localities in China, different sectors in the country. You also have interactions between the country and also the rest of the world. That's the logic for every economy. But just right now, people raise that terminology because the so-called internal circulation is supposed to give more confidence to the overall economic picture. Professor Liu, though, how much space is there?
Well, if we talk about domestic circulation, we have two focuses. One is the consumption side, the other is innovation side. In terms of consumption, Chinese savings rate is roughly at 38%, so there's still a potential. But we have to be careful in that, people save for good reason, not because they do not really want to spend on the luxury and more durable products, but they save for children education, for their retirement, etc., etc. So in order to boost the Chinese consumption power, there has to be further confidence that needs to be injected into consumers by providing a better social welfare belt and by providing better access of medical service and education. And the other is innovation. So I do not think that it is really cost effective simply say concentrating on indigenous innovation, although it is very important. So we still need to work collaboratively with the rest of the world and take on the basic science and work with those willing labs, etc. So overall, I could see that this concept of youth circulation has been projecting very mixed messages. So I hope the Chinese government can really clarify the situation. It is not that China is going to close the door against the world. It is the reality at the moment, but we continue to drive on a globalization basis, and this is where we have benefited for the last 4 decades.
Professor Townsend, how about those points? Meanwhile, how do you see that the economy be able to generate enough energy within itself, while at the same time keep on reaffirming with the idea of reform and opening up?
Yeah, I mean, you can't look at China, even though it does have a large domestic market now, you can't look at the history without, seeing that this had a lot to do with the engagement with the world, the exports, the foreign direct investment. That was incredibly important for a good 20 years, less important now, obviously. And so that's a huge part of this situation, and I mean, we're seeing that change. We're seeing it between China and the U.S., we're seeing it between multiple countries. It's not clear where it's going. I think we're just seeing a sort of a resetting, that maybe the situation going forward, the international aspect of China as it relates to, say, the U.S., where I'm from, it won't be the same as it was for the last 20 years.
It is still a very...
Perhaps in some sense that's normal, but in obviously things are a lot more tense than they were 5 years ago. So yeah, I mean, this is shifting almost on a weekly basis now, depending what comes out of the White House.
Very interesting, what you have just said. It's really a fluid picture, which means it is a test of adaptability and flexibility of economies, isn't it, Mr. Townsend?
Yeah, one of the things I do like about both China and the U.S. actually is both countries are fairly adaptable. When things happen, they change, and that's actually not that common in a lot of countries. A lot of countries get stuck. But China and the U.S. really do have that in their populations, in their governments, and their policies. So I think we're going to see things very different, say, 5 years from now than what we've seen. But it's going to take some time and a little bit of probably turmoil.
We have already seen 6% growth, of course, based on earlier very low growth rate. So, Professor Liu, it is a big question whether China will be able to maintain that growth rate and probably even higher. And by the end of the year, whether there could be a dreamlike 6% growth rate of GDP compared to last year, as that was the goal being set earlier, of course, without the knowledge of there could be COVID-19. Or lower, but to what extent? Numbers is not everything, but numbers do matter. So, Professor Liu.
Yeah, the second quarter we achieved 3.2, and now the third quarter almost 6%. So this is really a very good news that can inject confidence into manufacturer and into consumer, and also that the confidence can also be provided to all the stakeholders along the supply chain that are associated with China. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, that our figures do not really tell everything because right now we still are in the stage of rehabilitation rather than expansion. And right now the PMI are finally in the expansion stage, but it still needs to be stabilized.
Not only the China picture, but overall picture of the world. We have seen, Professor Townsend, the worst poverty rise might be since 1998, warns the World Bank. That is the latest coming out. And what does that mean for the Chinese economy? What will be the engine of the growth rate of the world? And how will China, in this prospect, being impacted and having its impact? That's a profound question, I know, but I do want to have your input.
I think businesses, government, families. It's almost like we have two modes. We have sort of ambition mode where we want to thrive, and then we have survival mode. And I think a lot of us are doing, everyone's just trying to get through this year right now. I think most businesses have been stuck in that for the last several months, which is the right move. I think there's this question of, are we going to shift back to the normal that we had last year, or are we going to learn to live with this thing? Because viruses come up all the time. I mean, the flu comes around every year, and maybe we're just going to get really good at managing this thing.
Getting through 2020, Professor Liu, do you think, as an economist, will be the best option for the rest of the year?
Safety is still the looming consideration, and now the security also becomes a great reason, but in the meantime misused the conception for further lockdown against the rest of the world. So now it is really a big test for those politicians because we do see a very divergent policy approach. One is that countries are being extra cautious to continue to maintain the lockdown, which makes the nation safer but less efficient. But there are nations that are concentrating on the reopening of the economy, return of the productivity, and that may bring up a higher exposure to personal safety. So this is going to be a very blurring picture with a lot of ambiguity.
There are a lot of ambiguities, and that's why some of the short-term plan could be very important. Professor Towson, meanwhile, we have seen the debate about what to do with the packages for every American inside the United States have been a political battle so far. I'm mentioning this not because it will have a direct impact on China's economy, but rather it will have a huge impact about how the U.S. will deal with its own financial situation and how the U.S. dollar, the value of it, will likely be in the future, and where does the money come from, and also, as a result, how the U.S. will deal with the other economies, including that of China. So, Professor Towson, I know, once again, it's a loaded question, but this is another important one.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is kind of trying to get its own house in order. Obviously, some states like California are in pretty bad shape. Others are doing better. And then, of course, the two political parties are fighting because that's what they do. And there's an election coming up, so everything becomes about that. So, yeah, the U.S. has a special role in banking and in currency globally. And the fiscal policies coming out of the U.S. don't strike, I think, anyone as particularly prudent, especially this year where the spending has really come off and spiked, major deficits this year. Yeah, I think I think a lot of the world's currency holders are going to be looking closely at what the U.S. does with the dollar. And this, I'm not an economist, but it doesn't look particularly assuring in general.
This is a stress test time, certainly. It has been continuing for some time for all economies. That includes China's and certainly includes that of the United States. For now, we want to thank both of you for sharing your insights. Jeffrey Towson, Liu Baozheng, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.